This is the May 16th meeting of the Inspector General Committee. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
State Attorney Ehrenberg,
Sitting in as designee for State Attorney Dave Ehrenberg, who is in New York right now, Al Johnson, Chief Assistant State Attorney.
Commissioner Cruz,
Here.
Public Defender Howitt, Commissioner Crydell,
Present.
Vice Chair Cumberland, Commissioner Romano, Chair Schulman.
Present. And we're told that the public defender is running a little bit late, but should be here shortly. Okay, we'll go into item 3, introductory comments. Are there any from the committee? Hearing none, we'll go into item 4, approval of Inspector General Committee meeting minutes from November 15th, 2018. I'm assuming everybody had a chance to review those minutes. Are there any discussions or motions?
Move approval, Madam Chair. Second.
Motion made by Commissioner Cruz, seconded by Commissioner Crydell. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, the minutes are approved. And we'll go ahead and jump right into the 6-month status report and a presentation by Inspector General John Kerry.
Well, good morning, Madam Chair, honorable committee members. Thank you for coming here today. I look forward to briefing you here and taking any questions and comments that you have. First, just to start out, we want to recognize May is Ethics Awareness Month. And we had, on May 7th, the Board of County Commissioners gave a proclamation proclaiming May as Ethics Awareness Month for the county. And I want to particularly recognize Mark Bannon, our colleague over here, for, as usual, taking the lead and putting the proclamation together. And so thank you, Mark, for taking the lead on that. So again, you might recognize some of the faces up there who was there during the proclamation. So again, we're trying to get the word out of some of the things we're doing this month and to make it awareness to not only to promote ethics, but also to report fraud, waste, abuse, things that folks should be reporting to us. So this will be the outline for today. Do we need to stop and for the notes and recognize?
We'll let the record reflect that our public defender has joined us. Thank you.
Good morning. So here's our outline for today, what we're going to be talking about, again, for our activities, primarily the last 6 months, October 1st of last year through March 31st. And again, I always like to, I know you're very familiar with our mission of what we do, but I do like to go over this not only for the committee, but primarily for a lot of people who are watching on Channel 20 and who will see this about what is the mission of the Inspector General. Again, we talk about providing that insight, oversight, foresight to promote integrity, efficiency, and effectiveness in government. And I'd like to emphasize this because we've been in existence now for 9 years. And on occasion, I'm asked by some senior folks in government about some of the audits we're doing or some of the contract oversight. They say, John, why are you doing this? Why aren't we investigating fraud, waste, and abuse? And I always bring them back to our charter. The very first line in our charter of our mission statement is the IG is created in order to promote economy, efficiency, and effectiveness in government programs. And yes, we have a particular eye toward looking at fraud, waste, and abuse, but our charter, which all Inspector General offices across the country, from the state, local, federal level, that is the standard mission. So it is just not looking for fraud. It is trying to find ways, like I like to talk about in the next chart, is just not providing that oversight, but providing insight to try to help make government better. So that's again, part of our mission, looking at auditing, contract oversight, to make government more efficient and effective in all government programs. And again, in doing that, though I might add, our auditors and all of our staff are particularly trained for signs of red flags of potential fraud, waste, and abuse. So when we're out there doing those audits and the contract oversight, when we see signs that could lead to fraud, waste, and abuse, they're attuned to that, they pick it up, and then that may lead to, and it has in a number of occasions, lead to some very significant investigations. Now, I like to every time just introduce you to some of our new staff in the last 6 months. And this time, I have to tell you, you will be impressed by the credentials of the people who have come on the IG team during the last 6 months. And I'm going to note as they come on from the people who came on first to the most recent. And I want to start, first of all, with Eric Hathaway, our investigator. Eric, where are you? Back there. Eric has over 24 years of investigative experience, starting out right here in Palm Beach County. He had 4 years on the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department. Then he went into the FBI as a special agent and supervisory special agent for over 20 years. And he has expertise within the FBI of public corruption, investigations, investigating terrorist financial matters, financial crimes, an extensive resume in the FBI, not only as a special agent, but again as a supervisory special agent. So a great catch we've got there, and doing great things for us immediately. And next we have Linda Connor, our auditor. Linda? Linda's a graduate of Florida Atlantic University with a master's degree in forensic accounting. She's got a bachelor's in computer information systems. And she has extensive 15 years experience in auditing, information technology auditing, and internal auditing, and external auditing. She was with, at one time, one of the big four public accounting firms. Her expertise, some of the fields that she has expertise in, is in data analysis, forensic accounting, and she's also brings with her, she's a certified Inspector General investigator. So she has a broad experience that can add a lot to our team. Next we have Sean Robinson. Sean's a graduate of the University of Technology of Jamaica with a master's and a bachelor's degree in business administration. Sean has 20 years of auditing experience in public service in Jamaica as an internal and an external auditor. And her strengths, areas of expertise particularly, are variance analysis, data analysis, conducting financial, operational, and investigative and value-added money type of audits. And then just this week, we have Jamaris Lormestois, DJ, just joined us on Monday. And DJ is a graduate of University of Pikeville with 2 bachelor's degrees, one in accounting and one in management. He's working on his master's at Florida Atlantic University in forensic accounting and looking to graduate this summer. He has 5 years experience in supervising a team of senior accountants, training employees, and investigating variances on profits and loss statements. So we've got an impressive team. And I did fail to also mention Sean. She is also working on her master's degree in a master's of accountancy at Palm Beach Atlantic University. So I mean, we've got an impressive team here that we're really happy that you all joined, so thank you all. Now I want to do a little more bragging. I'm sorry, but we got to brag on some of our good folks that we're doing here. Calenthia Dillard, as you know, again, she was awarded the award just this year. She had been in the past one of South Florida's 50 most powerful black leaders in business and industry. She just recently received this award. And it's awarded by the Legacy Magazine, one of the nation's largest black publishers. And we've joked with Calenthia that I'm going to have to get her a larger office for all of her awards and plaques that she's got. I mean, it's really impressive. Now, during this time, also in this last 6 months, she became a certified Inspector General investigator, which is a great tool to have in her belt that she can assist us in providing oversight and providing her input to making sure that our investigations are quality investigations, the top quality, and if need be, she could conduct investigations herself. And my final, just to brag on a couple of our folks, Megan Gaylord, our Director of Audit. During this past 6 months, she obtained the certification of Certified Information Systems Auditor, which is, in the auditing world, a lot of auditors have a lot of certifications. This is one of the top certifications. This is very difficult to obtain this certification. And there are very few in the big picture of auditors, very few auditors that have this certification. So on her own time, again, she went out mainly and studied, took the test, and became a certified information systems auditor, and this will add a lot to our capabilities as an office. She also maintained the Toastmasters Competent Leader Award. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Toastmasters, the way they do it, there's a level of awards. It's kind of like the belts in martial arts. And as she's going up, this is the higher degree of, one of those black belts that she's getting in the Toastmaster system. And related to that, she is a highly regarded state and national speaker. And she has asked a number of places. We turned down a number of places who asked her to speak at places. Just in this last 6 months, she's spoken at the Association of Local Government Auditors National Conference, the Association of Government Accountants, the Women's Webinar Leadership. She's spoken at Florida Government Financial Officers Association. Some of the areas that her expertise is that she gives instruction on to other auditors: internal auditing for forensic accounting, auditors' role in investigations, and information technology audits. So we're really just lucky to have Megan. Yes, ma'am. Okay, now I've asked to do it just a little bit different this time. What I want to do this time is have each of my division directors brief their specific activities. So during this time, I'm going to have Stu Robinson. He'll be briefing intake and investigations. Karen Mayer will be talking about contract oversight activities. And again, Megan Gaylord, our audit activities. And then later on, you'll hear from Calenthia Dillard for an update. So let me turn it over to Stu to talk about our intake activities.
Good morning. Thank you for your time. I'm here on behalf of the division that handles initial intake from the public, from government, to our office, and I'm also here on behalf of our investigative team. Before I begin with our activities for the period, I'd like to talk a little bit about the training our folks receive, and one particular award. We have our two newest investigators, Hugo Belanger and Eric Hathaway, both attended the CIGI, the Certified Inspector General Institute, last March, a couple months ago in Jacksonville, and are both now Certified Inspector General Investigators. And also worth noting, our newest investigator, Eric Hathaway, received the National Federal Inspector General Intelligence Community Annual Intelligence Community Award for collaborative investigation with, on behalf of an investigation that he was the FBI's lead agent on, that was worked in conjunction with the CIA and federal IGs on a falsely labeled protective military equipment matter. So he did that just before he left the FBI and came back home to his home base of Palm Beach County. So we're proud of both of them, and the entire investigative team has done some extraordinary work in the current period. Before I begin with our activities, I want to highlight that there's two distinct sections of the investigations intake division. So when you see our statistics, you'll see that some of them are particularly referring to our intake numbers. So when you see referral numbers, those are particularly referring to our intake activities, information that comes into our office. And then some of these numbers are particularly relevant to our investigative activities. So let's begin with those. For our intake activities in the current 6-month period, we had 58 complaints of wrongdoing, led to numerous referrals to other divisions within our office and to law enforcement and various commissions on ethics. The numbers are less than the previous 6 months. We tend to find that those numbers are cyclical, and I'll get to the sources of the numbers. We know that they're cyclical and they go up and down the intake that comes first time into our office. But when they're down, we try to make note of that, and we try to increase our outreach to make sure that those cyclical numbers continue to produce information that's useful to us and viable going forward. The sources of our complaints that initially come into the office to our intake section primarily come from citizens, but they also come from anonymous sources, and they come from government agencies, including municipalities, county agencies, and the other section that you'll see there is primarily from the special taxing districts, the SWA and Children's Services Council. The types of intake that we received in the past 6 months is consistent with what we've seen in the past. The majority of them are allegations of employee misconduct. That doesn't necessarily mean that the employee misconduct is what we end up predicating into full investigations, but that's the majority of what comes in. The other thing that's notable about this is the 10% that is not our jurisdiction section reflects still information that we've generated through our office, through our hotline, through our outreach, so that when that non-jurisdictional item comes into us, we can make sure that it's referred to the appropriate agency or to the appropriate law enforcement or ethics partner. Now on to our investigative activities. The number of ongoing investigations for the current 6 months is 12. That is not a snapshot, and it was 13 in the previous 6 months. So those numbers represent investigations that were active at some point during those 6-month periods, relatively consistent. We have significantly more referrals to law enforcement or commissions on ethics during the last 6-month period. Those referrals include federal law enforcement, the State Attorney's Office Public Corruption Unit, PBSO, and the state and county commissions on ethics. One of the things we've been trying to stress is to not let our investigations linger. We want to cut to the chase if they're viable for information that the public needs to know about, where we can provide value. We want to do that as quickly as possible while remaining true to the foundation of finding out the entirety of what took place. So we're still trending well in that direction. The average, and this is a snapshot number, as of March 31st of this year, the average months open for our active investigations was 9.5 months. We anticipate that we will continue to trend in that appropriate direction. I'd like to highlight a report that we put out in the past 6 months. This was an investigative report that was led by our investigator, Chris Dykman. It started with information that a legislative assistant in a municipality, Riviera Beach, was not disclosing her outside employment. And it wasn't just the lack of that required disclosure, but it was the relevance of that required disclosure, because the outside employment that was not being disclosed was about a consulting firm that this Riviera Beach municipal employee was running. That consulting firm was a consultant to Riviera Beach public officials. their campaigns, and that consulting firm was also consulting for pay with private companies with development interests in Riviera Beach, 2 companies in particular. There was also findings in this, issues in this report about a Riviera Beach councilman who introduced that consultant to some of these entities of conflict and did not mention his report his campaign contributions consistently with the records that we saw during our investigative work. Let's work through some of our other investigative highlights. Sometimes our work requires, per our charter, a referral to law enforcement when we feel that there is significant potential for criminal activity along our investigative path. One of them led to an arrest this month. Our investigative staff investigated a county employee that fictitiously created county records to fake unemployment, to make it look as if this county employee was terminated from county employment, when in reality this county employee was still employed. The reason for this was, with this fraudulently created unemployment or termination letter, that county employee then received about $6,000 of public assistance benefits. We referred this matter to the State Attorney's Office Public Corruption Unit, and it turned into an arrest in, I believe, January of 2019. We also issued an advisory letter to a municipality, the city of Lake Worth at the time, now Lake Worth Beach. Sometimes we do an exhaustive and thorough investigative matter, and it doesn't rise to the level that we feel that the public report is warranted. But we still want to inform the municipality, in this case, of our investigative findings. In this case, the municipality requested that we come in and do a thorough investigation, and we did one. We did countless interviews, records examinations. So when we were done, we documented to the municipality our findings. We gave them value so that they could understand exactly what happened, and so that we could give them some recommendations so that they could make sure their processes were appropriate going forward. Also, in the past reporting period, we found out the results from a investigation that we did a few years ago on former City of West Palm Beach Director of Communications, Elliot Cohn, who used his city position, his government position, and government resources to conduct private businesses, his private business, also a consulting firm. During the past 6 months, the State Commission on Ethics and Mr. Cohn agreed that he violated 3 sections of Florida statutes, and he agreed to a fine of $1,500 for each of those 3 violations. 1,500 times 3 for a total of $4,500. Also want to highlight one report that came out just past the 6-month period. It's been in the news in the past couple weeks. This investigation was led by our investigator, Hasai Tanaka. We found that in the city of Pahokee, the city manager, between November of 2015 and December of 2017, closed down City Hall and sent city employees home on paid vacation for a total of 86.5 hours. So that's 8 days, 6.5 hours over a couple-year period. Those hours were outside of ordinance. Ordinance gave city employees 12 days off for each of those fiscal years, and there were about 8 days, almost 11 days added to those days off outside of ordinance. The city manager also, beyond the scope of Florida statutory requirements, awarded bonuses to city employees. The City of Pahokee has accepted all of our recommendations and will ensure that, or have told us now that they're taking efforts to ensure that their future practices, personnel manual, and ordinance are all consistent and within Florida statutory requirements. Absent any questions from the committee, I'd now like to turn the presentation over to our Contract Oversight Division and Director Karen Mayer. Mr.
Before you do that, I
Sure.
do have one question.
Sure.
With respect to the advisory letter on investigative matter 2016-0003,
Yes.
I'm going to presume that the 2016 designation means that it was received in 2016?
It was.
Okay. But it was not, the advisory letter wasn't issued until late 2018?
Correct.
How long was this particular investigation in process, or was it delayed in being processed? I just want to get a feeling for that, because that's longer than your average.
It is, and that's one of the things that we've been focused on doing well and starting to trend towards doing better and better all the time. That particular investigation was put in abeyance in favor of higher profile investigations at the time. We were in contact with the city of Lake Worth throughout, and they knew that. And then when we started working on it, it was staffing allowed us and resources allowed us to put that investigation into clear context for the city. So it was about a 6-month investigation once we fully invested in it, and we met with the city and let them know that we were going to take that issue on and let them know exactly what the circumstances were.
Okay. And has this, to your knowledge, has the city taken corrective actions?
This was an allegation of employee misconduct.
Right.
So we made suggestions to the city to ensure that the type of employee misconduct that was alleged is they have a clear idea of how to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future. The city had adopted our suggestions, and absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep. Absent further questions, I'll turn the presentation over to Karen Mayer, our Director of Contract Oversight.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Oops, went too far. I'd like to talk a little bit about contract oversight and some things that occurred in the last 6-month period. First of all, Teresa Michael recently moved from investigations over to contract oversight, so we are currently fully staffed. Secondly, I'd like to brag a bit about our Inspector General. The Green Book contains 3 different sections. One is audit is Yellow Book, sorry. Investigations, and then they have one about evaluations and inspections. Contract oversight has always operated in the spirit of the Green Book, but John was instrumental in getting the association to create a course so that we could become certified as inspectors slash evaluators. So now we have the capacity and the ability to be certified in that way by our association. John also was the person who chaired the committee to develop the curriculum. And I'm sure many of you have sat on committees and perhaps led committees and had people be really excited about the concept of developing 4.5 days of curriculum for a course, and perhaps experience the less than robust response with instruction. So John ended up creating a lot of it, and he was the person who facilitated this first course. So Tony Montero back there, he and I went to the first course, and I didn't have expectations one way or another, and it's very draining to be in training from 8 to 5 and to have your mind be engaged. And what was really wonderful was all the people who came to that first training were very experienced people. Part of our role was to help figure out where we wanted to make changes in the curriculum, those kind of things. So by the end of 4.5 days, when we had to take a test that decided whether or not we became certified, we were all pretty wiped out. But what we all came away with, I think, was good ideas. I mean, here we were in a room with 16 other people from around the country, federal IGs, local IGs, and trading information, trading ideas, trading different ways of doing things. So it was a wonderful experience. And I think we all really came away with a lot from it. And so now we are no longer operating in the spirit of the Green Book. We are actually operating in accordance with the Green Book. And the next time we have peer review, that will be noted. So learned a lot of things from a lot of people. I think it helped us think about how we want to change things, what things we could do better. You know, it's always good to get ideas from other people and be able to perhaps tweak what you do. So it really was a good time, and I can't, you know, John can't really brag about himself, but I can brag about him, and he did really a wonderful job. So I wanted to share that first. Okay, next. Okay, our current activities monitored for that last 6-month period was 82. The value of those contracts was $773.7 million, and 43 procurement meetings were attended. The amount reviewed was a little bit higher this 6 months, and that was due to the fact that the Solid Waste Authority decided to RFP bid out their waste hauling contracts, which are very expensive, high-value contracts. So fairly similar to the last 6-month period, but with that change in terms of dollar value, mostly because of the SWA. Okay. Next, we'll go to our reports. This 6 months, we issued 2 reports. 1 recommendation was made, 1 was accepted. There were no cost savings this time. We did not issue any tips and trends, but we are in the midst of creating a tips and trend on contract administration, so that hopefully that will help different municipalities, more so than the county, but help them with contract administration and how you effectively do that. Next, we'd like to show you the kind of split between county municipalities and our special districts. So county, we monitored 43 activities, 43%, municipalities were 44%, and special districts were 13%. So that's kind of the split of the different entities we review. Next, we want to talk about the first contract report we issued. And this was the beginning report of our contract management review. So contracting really goes from the beginning, where you decide how you're going to procure something, you go through the procurement process, a contract is awarded, well, then the contract gets implemented. So we had spent a lot of work in the last years on that procurement process, but we really hadn't spent much time looking at how contracts were then actually administered. So we're starting to do that. This is the first report from that process. So Tiffany Thomas went out to Belglade, and she looked at the contract for the Torrey Island Observation Tower. This is a tower that was put in a park out there, funded mostly through grant funds. And what she found was that their contract was not totally followed. The contract said things like the engineer will review work as it's ongoing, the engineer will approve every work or payment application, which did not happen. They did not extend the contract when they were not able to meet the deadlines due to permitting issues that the city was having getting the vendor the permits. So what they should have done is extended the contract so it was still a valid contract when the work was done. The other thing that they did was they issued final payment, interim and final payment to the contractor before final building approval was given. Now granted, they had gone out, they had looked at the tower, they knew it was there, they didn't have real concerns, but they had had turnover. They contract for their building official. So they had had turnover, and that person had not signed off on the project. So technically, they had not complied with the terms of the contract. So our recommendations basically were about, when you have a contract, you need to follow those terms. You really need to think about how you administer your contracts so that you're actually doing what it says in the contract. If the contract doesn't work for some reason, then amend the contract. And it looks like you have a question.
I do. I understand what you're talking about because procurement issues are problematic for every entity. My question to you is, was there a complaint filed about this? How did
How
the
did we
IG?
pick this one? Well, what we had decided to do is to start doing reviews. You know, we decided that was kind of the next phase of going through the procurement process. We chose this project specifically because it was a surtax-funded project, and it was one that Tiffany had monitored through the procurement and had some issues with the procurement not being as tight as it could have been. And then thinking, well, you know, this is a really good one for us to look at. It's surtax funded, we want to look at more of those, and the procurement wasn't as tight as it should have been. So that was really why we picked it.
Okay, I had thought it was self-initiated. I just wanted to confirm
Yes.
it. Thank
And
you.
most of these contract management reviews that we do will be self-initiated. I mean, we may end up with some that come as a result of a complaint or concern by someone, but most of them are going to be self-initiated.
Great, thanks.
Now I'd like to talk about the penny surtax. Tony Montero is the person who follows that, follows the revenues coming in, looks at the reports that the entities produce at the end of the year, showing what they've spent the money on, goes to penny surtax committees, the different committees, at the oversight committees. So he really does a lot to look at the surtax expenditures and ensure that they're going okay, or at least they're going according to the ordinance. He has more statistics than anybody ever wants to see. Tony trained as an engineer. So if you'd ever like to see all of the statistics regarding the penny surtax, we'll be happy to show those to you. So I've talked about going to the oversight committee meetings, reviewing the project list, tracking the monthly surtax revenue, their performance, and reporting the result of our oversight to the public. So the report that he produced, it's called an OIG Insight, is on our webpage and is part of public education about what's out there, how is this money being spent. It is also a higher risk area, if you will, so it is one of the things we look at when we get procurements in and we're being told, here's a procurement meeting that's going to be held. If it's a surtax-funded project, and depending on what type of project, how well the project documents were written, it's more likely that we'll end up going out and actually reviewing the procurement. Last and not least, we have this great slide about how what you see is the tip of the iceberg, because a lot of what we do is build relationships out in the various entities, and we end up providing a lot of technical information. Especially in the smaller municipalities, they don't have specialized people who do procurement. They don't always understand or know about the different laws that they really should know about. One of the assistance that we provided this last quarter was stopping a solicitation for a city's audit because they had not followed the statute in issuing the solicitation document. And there really isn't a lot of state law that applies to municipalities, but interestingly enough, the annual audits that municipalities have, that the county has, there are very specific requirements, beginning with the fact that the governing body has to appoint the audit committee. Can't be the city manager. So sometimes people miss that. Sometimes they miss that there are very specific requirements relative to how the solicitation occurs. The audit committee has to approve of the evaluation criteria. They have to meet and review, recommend to the governing body, et cetera. We did find that as a problem as of a couple years ago. We sent out a tips and trends about that because we did a report about that. What we find is, in this municipality, the city manager had changed and somehow didn't know that this was a requirement. So we explained it to them, they canceled the solicitation, and they're starting again now doing it properly. So they'll be in compliance with state law. The same entity, we followed several of their procurements, and they either weren't following their own purchasing policies, how they handled things was not really appropriate. So we met with the city manager and had a long discussion about the ways in which they needed to correct what they were doing, to make sure that they were following their own policies and procedures, meeting the letter of the ordinance, not perhaps what they perceive of as the intent of the ordinance. So it will be interesting to see how that goes, because if that doesn't work out, then we'll be back and we'll be writing reports. So hopefully the explanation of what should be done will work. They'll improve their process and everyone will be happy. We also had a city that called us, had some questions about how to do vendor presentations. So when you issue a solicitation and the committee decides that they're going to hear presentations, those can be closed meetings, but if they are, they have to be publicly recorded. That's another thing that all people don't know about. We also issued a tips and trend about that. So we were able to help them understand, refer them to the appropriate places so they could understand what do we have to do to make this process work. We also had a situation in which one of the municipalities had various issues complying with the CCNA statutes, which is the Construction Consultants Negotiation Act. It's all about how you get architects and different kind of people. So Tony had that municipality, and so the first error they made, he called him up and said, well, you know, this is what the CCNA says, so you're going to have to shortlist because that's a requirement in the statute. So they did that. And then they did something else, and it was like, okay, can they get through this process? Are we going to have to call them a third time and say, you forgot this part of the statute, but twice was it, so that was a good thing. So we really provide that, try to do that foresight of trying to help people know what the law is. Most of what we find in our work is that people are just uninformed. They are good employees trying to do the right job, but they don't understand or that they don't really know what they should know. And when we find people who are not, then we generally refer them to investigations because it's an issue that involves them. So that's all about contract oversight. Is there anything that any of you would like to know? Yes, ma'am.
I have a couple of questions. In terms of some of the things you just described that your department does, is there any way to capture that in the report? And I ask that because, with all due respect, sort of the numbers about sort of reports and recommendations accepted are not terribly impressive.
Well,
and I don't doubt there's a lot of other things going on, and I'm just wondering if, as you're doing these 6-month reports, if there's a way to capture the other activities that
We
your
do and make those
division is
into a
doing
report?
that better reflects sort of the work that's being done and the value to the taxpayers from that work.
Well, that's certainly a possibility. I'll talk to, John and I can talk about that. We have talked about what are the metrics for contract oversight, because it is a different function. It's not that we're going out and doing audits, which have a very prescribed function and a form, and we're not going out and investigating based on a complaint or based on something else. And to some extent, we work ourselves out of work, you know, because if we do a good enough job, at least on the procurement end, people do what they're supposed to do and life is good, which is why we've now had the opportunity to start to look at the next part of the process. Because when we were trying to really ensure that the procurement process, the solicitations, all of that was being done properly, that's where we focused. So now we have the opportunity to focus on the next half of the process. And after that, part of becoming certified inspectors, evaluators, is that it also gives us the opportunity to think beyond just looking at contracts. You know, we can look at other issues and other things that may be of concern. So that's part of what we always are talking about. We're kind of the office that has evolved over time. Because as we learn, as we do, well, then we'll say, okay, well, what about, you know, we've seen this problem out there. What about us going and looking at that? So I think you'll continue to see us evolve, maybe into doing, you know, we looked at one city and said their building permit process is awful. You know, is that something that we go out and look at and do some sort of review on? It may well be. So that may be a part of how we expand and provide value for the entities in the public.
Okay, good. I have one other question, if I may.
Sure.
In terms of contract activities monitored, what does that actually entail?
What a
monitoring
contract activity is? Contract activity is what we call anything we work on. So a contract activity is opened when the decision is made that we're going to follow either procurement, maybe a complaint that has been sent to us instead of investigations because it wasn't investigatory in nature. It was more of a different kind of issue. It's when we start these contract reviews and we're looking at contract administration. So it's a way to capture work we're doing. And it's a way for us to document, to be able to show, okay, this activity was about the issuance of the SWA trash hauling contracts. Okay, so we started with looking at the bid document, looking at the RFP for the other contract, went through that whole process. So it's a way to show what we're doing.
So one more follow-up, sorry. So
what we're here for.
in terms of current contract activities monitored, 82.
Correct.
Can that be activities within one contract? I mean, multiple activities within one contract,
No.
or is that 82 separate contracts?
Generally, they're separate. I don't think we've had an instance where there are multiple. I mean,
Okay. I
it
wasn't
could be if, for example, we go out and do a procurement about this, and we find that, even if we found that there was some other issue about something else, we'd most likely open a new activity. So an activity is really in and of itself.
So maybe I'm not understanding. Is it an activity within a contract, in which case the 82 number does that reflect 82 contracts?
Not necessarily.
Okay, that's what I was asking.
And I think
Okay.
that may be part of our evolution of our nomenclature.
Right.
We started as contract oversight, and originally when we were started way back, we looked at the number of contracts people, municipalities, et cetera, issued. And once you've done that long enough, it's like, okay, that's nice, but are we finding any trends? And the answer is no. So then what we did was say, anything that comes in that we decide we're going to work on, we're calling it a contract activity. And it may not directly be tied to a contract, generally is, because procurements end up in a contract usually, or you can have a procurement that's canceled for some reason, so that is closed at that point. No contract is ever issued. But we just call them contract activities because it's what our department's called.
Okay. All right, thank you. That's all. Thanks.
Okay,
Any other questions?
in that case, I will turn it over to our audit director, Megan Gaylord.
And while there is a changing of the guard, we just want to reflect Commissioner Romano joined us during that presentation. We didn't want to interrupt.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
For the record, my name's Megan Gaylord. A few of them have already said that, though. Thank you for having me here for the audit updates. I'm very excited to present them to you.
Actually, we thought you were going to do a Toastmaster speech. We're all
I could
waiting.
if you really wanted to.
Give her time. That's at the end, right?
If you want. It's all about making you happy. For this 6-month period, our staff has done some amazing things, but first I want to focus on the achievements they've made personally. Jennifer Timms obtained her Certified Inspector General Auditor certification. Radi Edrova also obtained her Certified Inspector General Auditor certification. And she also went on to obtain her Certified Internal Auditor, her CIA designation through the Institute of Internal Auditors, which has a 40% pass rate per exam and consists of 3 separate exams. For the audit activities this period, we've been very busy. We produced a couple less reports this time, but our recommendations almost doubled from the last 6 months when we did have additional reports. We had 100% acceptance on those recommendations. 131 were made and 131 were accepted. A good portion of them have already been implemented. The entities took very quick actions this period. We had approximately $1.2 million in questioned, identified, and avoidable costs, combining all the audit totals. We had 10 referrals from the different audit reports, which I'll talk about more when we talk about each audit. We issued 1 tips and trends for investing surplus funds, and we had 1 additional project that took a lot of resources to do a quality assurance review of the prior period, which is required for us under Yellow Book. The first audit that we put out this period was the Water Utility Cross-Connection Program audit for the town of Lake Clark Shores. We started conducting the Water Utility Cross-Connection Program audits because taxpayer funds were paying for these programs, so we wanted to ensure taxpayer funds were being properly guarded, as well as the efficiency and effectiveness of the program, and to ensure that the program and operations were performing properly and in compliance with their many requirements. This audit resulted in 2 referrals, 1 to the state EPA and 1 to the county health department. We found that the town had outsourced their services to a consultant and a vendor to coordinate and manage the program for them. The issue with that was the town council never approved the contract that they were using, which resulted in the majority of the question cost. In addition to that, the billings weren't being properly completed. The ordinance and the resolution had conflicting rates. So if the ordinance had been used, a higher rate would have been billed. Instead, the town was billing by the resolution. So they were losing money, which is what resulted in the identified costs. While it's not a lot of money, it is still money that they should have received. And if they started implementing the ordinance rates, they would have increased their revenues each year. There was inadequate review of the invoices, which resulted in services being performed that were outside of the scope of the contract, miscalculations of the billings, where the town actually owed the vendor money because the town hadn't properly billed them the correct amount, and a lack of support for the invoices, which is missing inspection reports and different documentation that's required to show the compliance with the program to ensure that the devices are properly working. The subcontractors that the vendor was using were required to be bid according to the contract, and no documentation was provided to show that those subcontractors had been bid as required by the contract, and the subcontractors lacked the required licenses to perform the fire protection device services. So all of the fire protection device inspections, even though they were considered to be passed, they really didn't count because the proper inspector hadn't completed them, so they had to be redone. Since the audit, the town has revised their ordinances and resolutions. They're amending the contract to resolve the discrepancies and the methods used for the subcontractors, and they're improving the monitoring and oversight for the vendor. During the period, it also happened that the county auditor for Broward County was performing water utility cross-connection audits, just like we were, based on the higher concerns that the drinking water is a public safety issue. So they included their review, which produced similar results to what ours had been showing. So it shows that multiple areas are performing similar types of audits for efficiency and effectiveness. The next audit that we put out this period was performed by Radi Edrova. She performed the audit, which came in based on a complaint. We received a complaint of vendor wrongdoing, so we initiated an audit to review the contract, as well as we expanded the scope to include the permitting process because it was directly linked to the issue at hand. The permits weren't issued for all of the projects the way they were supposed to be, so only about half of the projects under the contract had proper permits, which resulted in most of the projects not having the proper inspections either. This resulted in a portion of the question costs. The contract terms were also unclear, so work was being performed that wasn't specifically stated in the contract, so some of the work was outside of the scope, which is what resulted in the highest amount of the question costs. The identified costs were from permit fees not being properly charged. Because the village didn't properly implement the way they were doing their permits, with one master permit being reevaluated with additional charges for the fees as they issued more and more work, they were only issuing permits here and there haphazardly for the work that was being completed. So only that portion of the work being completed received the proper permits, which led to the village losing money. The plus is, since the audit, they fully recouped the amount, and they recouped the $8,800 from the vendor for the permitting fees. So it had a very positive outcome in that regard. And we also detected that invoice payments had violated the Prompt Payment Act. The village had entered into what they thought was a more restrictive policy that had a 30-day requirement for payment, but for construction it's a 20-day required payment. So they actually ended up owing the vendor money for interest payments because they had been paying late on the different invoices. And then the avoidable costs that we found were as a result of the interest, that if the village revised their policy, got into compliance with Florida statute, and started paying the invoices on time, they could avoid paying future interest payments to vendors. Our third audit was conducted by Hillary Bojan. She's our expert in data analytics, and this was one of the first audits that we implemented data analytics, which will be the second slide to just go over how we've used that to help expand our success rates in audits. This audit started as a routine and planned audit with slightly higher risk based on the turnover in management. It got expanded during the course of the audit to include travel for the council members, and it also got expanded based on a complaint for an employee's tuition reimbursement. I'll start with the complaint because that's the smallest piece. We received a complaint during the audit that an employee who was a human resources individual was obtaining a degree in criminology, and it was outside of their job descriptions and violated the policies. Came back that it was in violation. It didn't follow the proper policies. The payments hadn't been documented for approvals. The amounts had been improperly calculated, and the rates were not proper. And they were also reimbursing for things that shouldn't have been reimbursed. So the recommendation at the end was that the employee was not eligible to receive the money that they received, and that the city should consider collecting the money back and not make the additional payments because it didn't follow the proper protocol. So it was a supported allegation. The purchasing card portion of the audit had significant findings because we all know purchasing card transactions are relatively low dollars, so to have $500,000 of question costs in one audit for transactions that are $10 here, $50 there is extremely high. And it means the sample was extremely large because of the high risks and red flags with the data analytics. This audit had 6 referrals. 5 referrals to the intake division in our office, and 1 referral at the end to investigations. We found throughout the audit that there was a lack of pre- and post-approvals for the transactions. There was a lack of documentation and receipts, and there was a lack of documented business purpose, which was required by policy. Purchases were for prohibited items. And the prohibited items was by their policy, but the types of items that we're referring to are donations, luxury items and upgrades from coach to first class, or the business economy with extra legroom, which was a violation of their policy. Items were shipped to non-city addresses, which was required by their policy. It went to a city location. Foods required to be approved by the city manager, which was not the case. They had gifts that were to outside parties, and they also purchased hazardous chemicals, which were not authorized under policy as well. During this, because of the amount of issues we were concerned about, we conducted a test to take a sample of different items that had been purchased and go out and physically see those items to go, okay, well, you said you bought this, so let's see it. We want to see what you have. When that happened, we found that a relatively large portion of the items we went to go see weren't there to be seen. So we found that TVs were missing, fire tablets were missing, projector, computer equipment such as headsets, speakers, and different upgrades. Some phone items were all missing. So that we recommended that they control those operations for, if they're gonna buy it, they should really track what they bought and make sure they can produce it if asked. We also found that there was a lack of proper authorization for the card holders and credit limits. So the credit limits were being exceeded on a monthly basis, which was predominantly the case with police operations. They had a tendency to exceed the monthly transaction limits and the monthly amounts per card. We found that in some instances, transactions occurred after employees left, but they weren't fraudulent transactions like you would think. It was reoccurring transactions that were hooked to the card. So they all got canceled and were resolved, and they weren't fraudulent type items, but still a concern that transactions can occur once somebody leaves on their card. With the travel for the council, we found that there were a few items that had problems, that the travel lacked receipts and proper support. The amounts exceeded the travel policy amounts for things like per diems. Instead of using per diems, they used the actual receipts for the meals, which was more than what was allowed. And then we also had that some of the items were non-reimbursable items, such as seating upgrades and the luxury type items. And we also found during the audit that there was P-card violations for PCI compliance, which means you're supposed to protect the transactional information, the name, the account number, the 3-digit security code, and the city hadn't properly maintained the purchasing card compliance for the protected information. So with this, we planned the city's audit, which was a routine audit. We implemented the data analytics after we selected the city based on the large volume of transactions. They had over 4,000 transactions. Sadly, we ended up testing almost 3,000 of them because everything came back with red flags, and almost 60 to 65% of those transactions had problems. So the data analytics was accurate in the high-risk items it was selecting for us. We did searches with the high-risk transactions for keywords such as gifts, separated employees and dates of termination to see if there were continued transactions, MCC codes that wouldn't be specific, such as cruise ships and entertainment type items, to pull those types of transactions, even dollar amounts that would be in the same denominations of an ATM withdrawal. Good thing there were no ATM withdrawals in this, so that was a positive of that. And as we went through that, every time we selected them, we found that there was significant lacks of documentation and approval, which resulted in the $515,000 in question costs. But for some of the specific examples that we mentioned, there were $16,000 of gifts to outside persons. There were $5,000 of food purchases that weren't authorized according to policy, almost $2,000 of donations, $4,600 of upgrades for luxury type items, and $14,000 of computer purchases that weren't purchased by the IT department, which weren't authorized. So the data analytics had a high success rate for us with implementing it and starting to use it for our sample selections to make sure that we are getting the high-risk transactions, so we're not doing the random samples, which only produce a low yield or low dollars of finding the items that have problems. Our next audit this period was the
Excuse
town
me.
of...
We have a question.
Okay, I figured you might, but it was quiet for a second.
With regard to, I guess I'll lump them all together, improper expenditures, you mentioned that you had made recommendations. Has the city taken any steps to recover the money from the people who made the improper, for example, if person A upgraded $500 for a first-class ticket, was that person required to pay the money back?
At this point, no recollections have been made by the city. I believe that they're choosing to fix the problem forward and waive past recollection.
Okay, with regard to items that you wanted to lay eyes on that you were unable to find, was there any suspicion that those things had been converted to personal use?
It's always a possibility. It seems, though, that in some of them, there was staff changes where the prior person left, a new person came in. So you have a few different options for what could have happened. The person could have put them in a closet, and the new person didn't know that, so they didn't know where to tell us to look. It's possible that they walked out the door with the person, and it's possible that they were rededicated to another area during moves and different shifts. The records weren't there to be able to identify where the items were. It looked more like a disorganized issue and not quite tracking things well than somebody criminally benefiting for the personal use.
So, if I just want to make sure I understand, $500,000 plus of improper taxpayer money spent, just forgiven, and we'll try not to do it again in the future? That's pretty much the outcome?
And they've put in the controls to stop it in the future forward.
Okay, thank you.
Please.
This is kind of jaw-dropping, actually. Do you have a protocol, or did you refer out some of these issues to other agencies, such as the Commission on Ethics, perhaps my office, if you thought there was criminal activity afoot? Is that part of your protocol? How does that work?
For this one,
let's key on this one.
For this one specifically, we referred it to our investigations division to look at it further, and no one found that there was criminality in it, which is why it didn't make it as a referral to the state attorney's office or public corruption.
Okay, what about the Commission on Ethics, the Code of Ethics, misuse of official position which might not rise to the level of criminality, but certainly would be a Code of Ethics violation?
Most of these were policy violations more than code of ethics violations. We can refer it to them now if they want to look into it further for the ethics items.
If I could.
Yes.
The commission, anything, the times that we do find things that on the commission, we try to either immediately or in the time refer it to them. There are some times where we may miss some things, but the commission, Mark gets, in the office, gets a copy of every report that we put out for review. So they have a copy of this report, and I'm not sure if we made referrals over to you on this, Mark, or not, particular issue, but they get a copy, and if there's something, so we try to be sensitive toward that. And again, this comes back to last time, the chair asked us about, some of the times we find these things in audits, is there some indicia, as you mentioned, of crime there? And again, in this case, for a lot of this issue, again, like Megan said, just a lot of very poor and sloppy accounting, where some of it may have been disposed and we did not have any other signs when she saw that, or when our investigative sign saw a lot of this, that it got to the level of an investigation. It's just more improper accounting. Again, some of it could have been in another part of the building. Some of it, in fact, we did find that we believe was disposed of. They thought it was disposed of, but they weren't keeping proper records of disposal. And back to some of the recoupment of some of the money, a lot of this money was city commissioners who are no longer there, who they decided to just let's let this go. We have new folks in town, and let's correct the issue for the future.
Well, General Carey, I've got one follow-up from 10,000 feet that I think might be helpful. The nature of the beast is these are thorough. Your office does thorough investigations, as you should. And thorough investigations takes a lot of time. They take a lot of time. The Code of Ethics provide, and I'm talking the civil aspect now, criminality aside, I mean, that's a different issue. There are far more civil violations of the code than there are criminal. I can count on one hand, I think, the number of criminal violations that have been filed. But the statute, the limitations of actions on the Code of Ethics, as you know, it's 2 years.
Yes.
So when you do a thorough investigation, very likely in a lot of cases, and this being one of them, the information that you ultimately get when your investigation is complete to the Commission on Ethics might be stale. It might be inactionable, unactionable. Do you have a protocol? Are you looking into that? Because the sharing of that kind of information, I'm looking more toward the P cards. I'm looking more toward, whether somebody's using their position to buy things that are not appropriate or allowed. And again, 99.5% it's an ethics violation and not a criminal violation. Do you or are you developing a protocol or a dialogue between your departments so that you avoid going past the 2-year statute?
That's a very good question. And again, we try to communicate with the Commission on Ethics when things like that come up, and we try. And again, that's a good point, well taken. That we'll take a concerted effort in that. In this, a little more background on some of those P card, like for example, when they were using the upgrade, that would be a good point for the Commission on Ethics to look at. However, what we found immediately, this was on the upgrade, that was an internal policy. It could be possible that, anybody can do an upgrade, but in their own policy, so their own city policy, it was prohibited to do the upgrade. So, again, that would be a good discussion to have with them, but when it came down to it, the commissioners stated that they were unaware, that they'd been doing that. They had self-approval to, and things had gone, from their perspective, gone through what happened when they were doing these, purchasing a lot of these things or spending money on what they call their prohibited list. From the city commissioner's perspective was, I submitted my paperwork. This is the way it had been done before me. I submitted my paperwork to the people who pay this. They pay this, and nobody ever came to me and said, oh, you're not supposed to do that. So I think but those would be obviously some good discussions to have with our colleagues over there. Is that in itself to the threshold?
It sounds to me like the combination of the two departments is just increases exponentially your ability to make the point.
Exactly.
And this is the poster child of making a point.
Yes.
It's incredible. It's $155,000. Holy mackerel.
And it was in the news. This was on in the papers and on the news, and was quite impactful.
Thank you for uncovering this.
I have a comment and a question. It's a remarkable series of findings. And it's remarkable not only by the magnitude of the dollars in total, but in terms of the endemic lack of management. The tone at the top is dreadful at best. I think that the internal controls probably don't exist. And my real question is, seeing as they've decided to ignore the past and sort of like most of the drivers in South Florida, don't look in the rearview mirror and just go, what what does your department intend to do to inspect what you expect and to follow up on whether or not they have made changes that will prevent this? Because I'm not impressed with somebody saying it's disposed. Disposed could be going in somebody's trunk.
Yes.
And this is unforgivable. If this were in the private sector, there'd be prosecutions. And I understand that you had commissioners. I understand all the nuances and the politics of it. That doesn't make it right. Doesn't make it acceptable. And as somebody who investigates these kinds of acts and crimes and malfeasances and bad decision making, I would have a very interesting report on this that would generate perhaps Mr. Johnson's agency being involved, and as well as some others. So my concern is the city of Riviera Beach is doing what it wants. But I think somehow we need to get ahead of them.
Thank you. That's an excellent point, and I do want to emphasize, along with this, we've worked closely with the state attorney's office in Riviera Beach on this. So they're very aware of the state attorney's office on these issues that we had, not only during this, but there was also an investigation that Stu talked about before. So they were informed as that was going on, and again, we're working close. And again, I think the public, and that's one area of the value of an inspector general, that sometimes there are things that don't rise to the level of being prosecuted, but you put out such a report as this has a tremendous public impact. You know, they have a new city council there. They're bringing back their old city manager. From all the talks that we had with them, even at the time with the acting city manager at the time, they were taking what we had serious, what we found, what we were recommending. They were taking it very serious. And again, they have a whole new, pretty much a new city council in place. They'll have their old city manager back in place, and we'll be back. Back to your question.
That's
Yeah,
the
we'll be
key.
back, but just like the Terminator,
Right.
we'll be back, and we will follow up to make sure that things are being implemented there.
Madam Chair, just wanted to follow up on Commissioner Kreidell's question. So you have pretty good assurance from the new regime in Riviera Beach that they take this to heart?
Yes, though, you know, the interim city manager, she is now retired, and they have another interim city manager until Jonathan Evans, if that goes through, comes on board. And we'll make sure when he, or whoever comes on board there, we'll make an appointment and quickly get with them. But the people in place at the time, they took us very seriously. City Manager Hoskins took us very seriously at the time, and her senior staff was taking us seriously and putting implementations in place as we brought them to her throughout the audit. So again, she's retired now, and we'll make sure and follow up with the new administration when they come in there.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I think you may fairly consider this a request from the committee to let us know in 6 months, and feel free to say the committee, wants an update.
Definitely.
So, unless anybody disagrees, I know I personally would love to hear, even in a 6-month period, what has been done and whether there's been any further transgressions. As far as the computer equipment, perhaps if it's not too stale, the employees who originally were the beneficiaries of that equipment could be interviewed. I don't know when these activities occurred, whether the criminal statute of limitations have run out, but if they're sitting on that equipment in their homes, at a minimum, they need to give it back to the taxpayers. The maximum is not for me to decide, but I'd be curious to know what happened to all of that equipment, not to mention $16,000 in gifts to outside persons and $1,900 in donations. All that should be given back. And that's not equipment that we need to trace. That's money that presumably you had a record of because you identified it. The money's got to come back.
Now, if I could, on the gifts and the donations, some of those gifts would have, when we trace down, everything has a real, you keep drilling down in this. This was one that was very detailed. On their prohibited list of their donations and gifts, they had other funds, so they were legitimate donations that could have been made under other funds and mechanisms within the city. So when we looked at the donations, tell me if I'm right here. Do you want to
I can
talk about that?
clarify.
Okay.
Most of the donations that they had were gift cards for specific program use, which were fine under the programs they were authorized, or for an after-school care program, they gifted backpacks with school supplies to underprivileged children. And it was those types of gifts that were disallowed by their policy, but a perfectly okay program item. It wasn't a gift where they handed $100 to their neighbor and said, here's $100, good job.
Well, that's certainly a lot better.
So it's,
And that
it's
changes things. So,
policy
information,
violations.
and if perhaps we could receive some clarification the next time, what did happen to those gifts? What were they for? If deserving children received them and it was a policy issue, I can't imagine anybody complaining, but, there seems like there should be protocol in place, because how do you choose one deserving school over perhaps another deserving charity? And, maybe it's not for them to decide, but if that's a policy issue, I think we want to make sure they are following their own policy at a minimum. And with regards to the statute of limitations, I think a good point was raised in General Carey as far as any discussion of protocol. I understand the need to, hold certain things in abeyance, and certainly when there's a criminal referral underway, nobody ever wants to get in the way of that. Perhaps something could be referred civilly or to the Commission on Ethics to at least be opened, and then can be held in abeyance, but at least something can be filed. Ethics charges can be filed so as not to lapse that time. Something to discuss and think about.
Yes, we've done that on a number of other cases before. We have done that on other times we do that. Again, in this case, I think when when you drill down into the details, there was extenuating circumstances that, again, did not, again, rise to my sensitivity at the point that it was potentially an ethics issue. But again, point taken, and I'll keep that in mind. But we have and we do refer things and speak to the Commission on Ethics while we have ongoing cases. We don't wait until the end. The case that Stu talked about, the investigation, the one on the that went to the Commission on Ethics, and it was passed outside of their 2-year period. That was a long, ongoing investigation, and we did not uncover till the end of the investigation some matters that would be under the ethics jurisdiction that, again, it happened to the end. So sometimes when you have a lengthy investigation and it comes out at the end, and so by the time we get it, it was already stale beyond the Commission on Ethics time that they could look at it. So,
Right.
but good point taken, and we will, and I'll be more sensitive to that.
Well, and certainly you don't want to jump to conclusions. And I understand the last thing you want to do is make a referral and unfairly suggest that something's a violation before you've, really reached that conclusion. So that's, that's a very fine line to walk. And I think just the suggestion that you seem to be hearing and we're suggesting is have that dialogue, and that decision can be made. But certainly if a conclusion hasn't been formed, you can't prematurely create one. I think we have a couple more questions.
I just have, I have a comment and a question. So my first comment is, while I appreciate everybody's concerned about this, what we really have are question cost of $515,000. We just talked about $444,000 in question costs from Tequesta, a far smaller community. So I don't, I'm not sure getting so up in arms about Riviera Beach is necessarily appropriate given what we've seen in other communities that are actually smaller. But I am interested in the P card use. We use a P card, and so I made a note, let me check our protocol for it. And is that a process that you have audited with other municipalities or agencies? And do you have sort of the ideal P card policy to provide to those who may need to see it?
Yeah, P card is, purchase cards is a high risk
Yeah.
at all government levels.
Yes.
And there are internal controls that we recommend any place we go. In this particular case, there just was not, with the city council members, they had the authority. Here's a real bad situation. You should not be able to be the approving authority that I have authority to give myself an exception. That's not a good idea, any place. In my office, again, Debbie, when I travel someplace, and there's occasions that I forget what the P card, can be used for. Now, fortunately, I don't have one. That was another problem. They gave all the city commissioners and the mayor were issued a P card. I don't have one. We have one P card in the office, and we go to Debbie, and that is a good control mechanism. She knows how it should be used. I rarely use it, and I forget what it was, but something I said, well, can we put that on the P card? And she immediately knows, no, we can't put that on. We can put these things on. And so it is a common area that we look at in municipalities, P card use. There is not a perfect protocol, but we do often point to them that there are other cities we've been to that they've passed and have good protocols. And usually in the IG world, they try to keep us out of giving specific recommendations and let our recommendations be general to let the city use, though we point to certain best practices that other cities use often, but we don't carry around, here's the magic protocol.
Okay.
But it is, and I might mention again, it's important to know that these three terms of money, they're IG terms: question cost, identified cost, and avoidable cost. These are national terms, and most of them started out with the federal 1978 Inspector General Act that all federal IGs use. And most state and local IGs will use this similar terminology when we're categorizing the money. Question cost sounds, on first blush, if you don't look at the definition, sounds really bad because you think you were questioning, it may be illegal or something. Question cost in and of itself is I like to say it in the most basic terms, question cost is money that is being spent that is not in line with the regulation and law. So a lot of times the question cost, like for example, the gifts or like the donations, it's questioned not for the fact that it is illegal or in the sense that it is unethical or we have a question that it may be criminal. It is questioned because you used that money you have certain regulations, certain ordinances that says you pay that out of this procedures and this pot of money because it has checks and balances. That would go through checks and balances. You don't pay it out of P card. And so a number of the times when we have question costs, it's not that the money is sometimes it is wasted, but it's generally because it's not being spent. We're not properly accounting for the taxpayers' dollars. It's about properly accounting for taxpayer dollars. Identified costs are those dollars that can be potentially recouped, and avoidable is for the future. But these are standard terms. I'm asked this often in municipalities in the county who are audited. Where do you come? Are you making this up? No, these are clearly defined by statute, and these are nationwide Inspector General terminologies and criteria that we use.
I just want to create a little context. Government is not the only place where P-card issues occur. P-card issues are rampant through private sector. Every large corporation, even small mom and pop businesses, have P-cards, they just don't realize it. The ability to control where, when, and how, and by whom P-cards are used is the key. Internal controls are the key. Training is the key. So this is not surprising. I think it's surprising in terms of concentration of municipality where this occurs. But other than that, this is an issue that is pervasive throughout the financial services industry, and the entire private sector. So it's not an aberration by any means, but it does require attention. It does require changes and better internal controls.
Madam Chair, I'd like to follow on Mr. Johnson's comment earlier about the 2 years statute, the limitation on ethics violations. That's in the ethics, the code. But what about if they're criminal activities? Is there another?
Madam Chair, may I? I was thinking about this when at the last minute I found out I had to come to the meeting. Because I don't have a ready answer. I think I'm not aware that this has been litigated. The code itself says 2 years. The state law on a misdemeanor that is a misdemeanor committed, that's 2 years as well. But if it's committed by somebody in office, an official by state law, then there's an extension of that statute of limitations. But I don't know whether the state law is going to trump. That's going to be litigated because I've never seen it before. So the best practice is to consider the state and the Commission on Ethics as having what the code says is a 2-year limitation of action on an ethics violation. I think that's the best practice. And then we can figure it out if it's bad enough that it has to be prosecuted. We'll further research and then litigate if appropriate.
And just one follow-on, if I could. And you've alluded to this several times already. Is there a way to clue in the Ethics Commission, even though your investigation hasn't completed? I know that's a judgment call.
No, we often do. And in fact, sometimes we refer things, but oftentimes we just go over and we have discussions. We'll just have discussions about a case. So here's what we think we've got, and so we have informal liaison. So that occurs also. So that does occur. It just it did not in this, again, for I think the reasons that I described. And I still think when we talk, and you have the case yourself, if you look that over, I'm not sure that this case the things would have risen to the level. But again, point taken on, I'll be more sensitive, but we usually do. When we have something, we don't wait to refer it. We often have, the first thing we do is we have a discussion with one of the representatives.
Could I ask this question? There are many attorneys in the room who can help with this. When does the clock start? When discovered by you?
I think it's...
It starts when the event happens. In other words, if either a crime or an ethics violation occurs, that's that date. Sometimes it's a range of dates, but 2 years from the date that you put in your complaint, if it's Commission on Ethics, that's the operative. If it's 2 years and 1 day, done.
Okay. Thank you.
It seems like when, I understand the value of P cards, but it seems like if they're passed out kind of wholesale to an entire mayor and commission, and even if they mean well and just don't understand the scope that the lines are supposed to draw within, once the money's spent, then you're faced with the daunting task of of trying to collect from people who are often uncollectible, and then the costs associated with collection. Is the better practice to say, go to your conference, keep your receipts, turn them in, and if you spent money on something that's not reimbursable, you won't be reimbursed for it. And then that way the money never leaves the city. And along with that question, how do most cities handle expenses from their elected officials and those department heads or staff who incur those kinds of costs when they travel or do whatever?
Yeah, so that is exactly what you described as it should be, that it should be very controlled. And we did not poll all cities, but the number of cities that we polled and are familiar with do not just give out their P cards to all elected officials. They're controlled, just like, again, my office and probably a number of your offices. One person has the P card. Debbie makes the flight reservations and the hotel reservations, and that's, I think, about the only thing I can use the card for. Everything else, it's receipts that you come back, and if you extend the per diem for meals, now you get to the limit of what the meals are. I can go have filet mignon, whatever I want, but you have so much for the meals, and you should be aware of what you can spend, and when in doubt, you should go back and there should be a policy and somebody you can ask. And those are some of the type of recommendations we made to Riviera Beach, and they immediately said, you're right, definitely. With it, the commissioners, the mayor should not have there's no reason they did. There's a history, like in most places. They always had it, and it's hard to take it back. But they said, no, that was one of the recommendations we made. You bring it back, you have controls, you educate. That was another thing. Again, most of them were not aware that of any of the types of restrictions on these cards. They just used it like somebody had used it before. Again, they turned the receipts in and they were paid. And their assumption was, I turned this in, I've been doing this for years. Other people have do this for years and I get paid, and nobody ever gave me any instruction either before or after the fact that the way I was using this card was improper. And so multiple internal controls problems there and multiple recommendations. That's why our number of recommendations were so high. Many of those were to Riviera Beach on try to get internal controls in place. And again, City Manager Hoskins at the time, and her staff, when we sat down, she clearly along the way was on board 100% and did as much as she could before she retired. Now it will be turned over to the next city manager and the city council, and again, we'll be back.
And last comment from me, at least, this seems like a good opportunity, obviously a very unfortunate situation, but also the next time around could be the model situation for how certain things were identified and completely turned around. So, I'm confident and optimistic that will be the case, and this will be example A in your future trainings. But I know for myself, I'm terrified of a P card and I won't touch one. So
Yeah, very wise.
when in doubt, walk away.
Yes, so. Again, a great job on Megan and the team that did this out there. This was extensive. It was a period, again, it went all the way back to 2015, so I'll let her talk a little bit too. But again, this was very extensive, and it covered, a number of years period though. So it was a major work that her and the staff did. So I'll turn it back over to Megan.
For the purchasing card 2-year question, the date of the transactions that were reviewed was October 1st, 2016 through November 28th of 2017. So the 2-year period has not expired yet for some of the transactions. Correct. In addition on this one, we knew there was going to be an issue with the transactions when we issued the report, so we issued the report a little bit differently. We had an exhibit attachment that went with the report that contained all 3,000 transactions that had a problem, the date of the transaction, the person, who did what, and exactly what the issue was. So the report that the Commission on Ethics has that chart in the back of it as well as anybody who looked at it, because we thought that that might be helpful for the city when they were trying to figure out, was this one department more of an issue than another? And it was everybody in the culture. It wasn't one area over somebody else. Since then, at the time, during the period, they didn't have an internal auditor for a while, and they recently were able to hire a very talented gentleman to take the role of internal auditor, who came in and at the end of the audit started sitting in on the meetings and going over the controls. And we talked in great depth about, here are some of the options, that there's no one way to fix something, but you can either let all the commissioners keep their cards and have independent reviews and required receipts, or pull it back and have one person with it. But it was their choice which one that they wanted to use. So that internal auditor is now involved in everything, and they're doing weekly reviews of the different transactions for the individuals that were at a higher risk. But with the travel question, the one item that they have to factor in when they do that, if they do the reimbursement basis, is what if they have a lost receipt? Or what if you can't get a receipt from a taxi cab? I know I just did a travel and I had a taxi cab and it's 3 weeks later and I have no receipt. So, and I know to get them, and I still had a problem obtaining that. So they have to have the policies to address those types of things too. And that internal auditor is starting to help them with the roadmap, and they've already started to implement different things. So we'll look into that more at the end, before the next meeting, to come back with their follow-up and kind of where they are now.
Thank you. And we have a question.
Just a very brief follow-up. My understanding is that this particular municipality hadn't updated its policies and procedures since the 70s.
That's inaccurate.
That's not true? They have? Okay.
In this specific instance, actually, their policies were wonderful.
No, I'm talking about Riviera.
I am too.
Oh, they were?
Their P-card policies were wonderful.
Oh, they were.
The problem wasn't the policy. The problem was nobody was following the policy, and nobody knew the policy existed.
So they were last trained on the policy in the 70s, maybe. But the other thing is, and not to put too fine a point on it, and this is for further discussion, especially with the Commission on Ethics in your office. But as you know, and as Stu Robinson knows for decades, you can't hand an investigation over with 3 months left to the statute.
Yep.
Understanding that you didn't think there was an ethical violation, which is more important. But I think going forward, this meeting is going to be positive. The suggestions are positive, both for my office, which is less an issue, but for the Commission on Ethics and the IG's office. So thank you very much, and that's it.
And the one more for Ms. Howoods. We are actually in the process of preparing a tips and trends to provide best practices, best practices and resources and areas that they can look at to enhance their purchasing card suggestions. And one of the presentations that I just did was about purchasing card programs and has about 70 slides for here's all the best practices and controls you could have. So if you're not tired of audit yet, we have more. We're not done yet. We have our next one, which is the Town of Jupiter Inlet Colony, which was conducted by Jennifer Timms. It was a revenue audit, which was one of our routine audits. We selected the town because we hadn't ever been there before, so we wanted to make sure that they had proper coverage. During the audit, we found that they lost potential interest revenue because the interest yield that they had wasn't in line with the better rates that were available. We found that they had lost revenue and refund credits, that municipalities are eligible to receive the taxes back from fuel payments. So they didn't ever register, so they were unable to claim the credit. Since then, they've registered and they're receiving the credits and filing the paperwork. The lost revenue, they were working with their bank to negotiate higher rates. We found that they misclassified revenue, that they accidentally recorded revenue as expenditures and payables instead of as revenue, which was referred to their external auditor so that they could correct it for the year end. The cash receipts did not reconcile to the computer permit system or to the financial computer system for the general ledgers. All three locations, all three sources of information had different results and $114,000 of unreconcilable differences between the systems. We are still looking into it and making phone calls to reach out to the customers and different people who had the permits. They lacked overall controls for review and oversight of the bank reconciliation process and the cash receipt reconciliation processes, and they lacked adequate policies and procedures. In this one, they did not update their policies for about 10 years, so they had that longer delay. We also had deposits that weren't being made within a timely fashion. They were being made 8 to 28 days later after being received, so 55% of deposits took more than a week. We also found that there were voided transactions, but no refund to the customers for the voided transactions. So we're still looking into that and trying to go back. The town didn't have very good records, so they've been going back through the warehouses and boxes and information trying to get us the rest of the records. Currently, they are in the process of correcting the different actions. They are negotiating the higher interest rates. They're reviewing their chart of accounts and updating the account codes to match the Florida requirements, and they're updating the policies and procedures.
Madam Chair, I just have a question. Did this audit come about because there was a complaint, or how did it?
It was a routine audit. We selected them because we hadn't audited them before, and they were smaller, so they had never had an investigation, they had never had an audit, and they hadn't had a contract oversight report level review.
Okay, thank you.
And our final audit report, but not our final product, is we conducted an audit of the Palm Beach County Office of Financial Management and Budget Office, Fixed Asset Management Office operations, department division, and then actual unit. This entity is responsible for obtaining and coordinating the tagging and records for the fixed assets within the county, and also the thrift store that the county runs and operates. This audit came from, it wasn't a complaint to our office, but their management had received a complaint, and they specifically requested us to come in and do an audit to make sure, because the complaint was about process issues. So their management requested that we come in for this one. We found that overall, many of the controls were generally adequate. We found that there was non-compliance with the security policies, procedures, and processes, which were, they had policies and procedures with specific requirements, and they weren't implementing them properly, which was because of a lack of training, we believe. We also had conflicting information across the computer systems. When we did this audit, we did 4 different areas. We had the security and compliance with the security policies, which was one area of concern that management had. We also had computer interfacing. They specifically wanted computer reviews done to make sure that the systems were talking together correctly, cash and inventory. So the computer systems had system differences and differences between the interfacing information. So there were some issues which we worked with them, and they started working on fixing them with the vendor at the time. There was a lack of segregation of duties in the cash and assets processes. We recommended that they enhance their policies and procedures to resolve most of the issues and to document a few additional procedures to help. We also had the fixed assets acquisitions weren't recorded within 60 days, which was how the operations were supposed to be working. So from the time that they received the invoice, then the asset, they were supposed to be recorded in the system and then subsequently tagged. In 73% of the assets, they weren't entered into the system properly or finally with all the records within the 60-day time period, and 17% of the assets weren't tagged, physically tagged within the 60 days after the process. So we recommended some enhancements to the processes. We also found during the computer system portion of the policy that there were 6 out of 25 records. We only did a small sample for the assets, but 6 of 25, which is 24%, were showing in the records, but they had been disposed, which is what created the question costs. We looked into it more. We don't believe it was criminal or somebody took the items home. We just think that there was a disconnect because they had a lot of staff turnover during that time. And then we also found that 120 out of 523, so 23% of the computer system records had incorrect custodian codes. So it still showed that somebody else was responsible for the asset, even though it had moved to a new location. So we made some recommendations about how to improve the different controls. And they've started implementing them, but this one just came out not very long ago, so we haven't had a chance to follow up with them yet. And I promise this is my very last slide before I give it back to John. We issued a tips and trends based on the investing surplus funds with multiple municipalities across the last year and a half. You've heard the same finding just about every time we come up and talk to you to tell you that interest rates went up, people haven't changed their investments or their banks, where they're receiving no interest from TD Bank and Bank of America, whereas if they use different Florida depositories, they can receive higher rates. And if they have a policy, they actually have more options available for different investing options for the surplus funds. So we found that multiple entities had these issues, so we issued a tips and trends to try to help the others get in front of the issue, because we want to help everybody have more revenue. And if it's as simple as changing your bank and you can have an extra $10,000 or $20,000 a year, it's a pretty easy fix. So we issued our tips and trends with suggestions to have the other municipalities consider investing their surplus funds in the options permitted under Florida law to increase their revenue, and to adopt an investment policy to increase the options available for investments, because Florida statutes allow them to have more options under it. Now I'm going to go away and let John come back, since I've had so much time with you guys. Thank you.
Madam
Thank you.
Chair?
We have a question.
No, not a question. Unfortunately, I have a preset meeting. May I have your permission to, you have a quorum, so.
We do. Thank
So,
you very much
thank
for
you.
your contributions. You know you have to come back next time now. And just a comment on the revenues, you might consider tracking that, because that is value added, that, I mean, something that never would have occurred to me to suggest. So it's not just about what the municipalities and county are spending that they shouldn't, but also the potential savings or increase in revenue. I mean, that's pretty smart. So you might just make a note of it and take credit for it.
Yeah, in fact, in those reports where we find it, we put that as in that avoidable cost category. So of potential, so that is calculated in those audits in future avoidable costs that
Great.
in reverse. So thank you to the staff who did a great job in providing some of the details here. Okay, we're on the home stretch. Training and outreach. Here's some of the things just that the people we've talked to during this past 6 months. You can see a number of the government folks of where we've focused during this last 6 months. Again, a number of those, the state and national training presentations, that's mainly, again, Megan has done those and I've done some of those. A number of media contacts, and mainly those are related to some of our projects that we've been doing. Again, this is just an example of some of the places we've been doing. I want to particularly give a shout out to the county. I put Team Palm Beach County up there. That's some of their logo for their excellence in supervision. The county has invited me, and I give a brief introduction to the Office of Inspector General to all new county employees. They also asked me, and I give a brief presentation to their supervisors. They have a supervision course that all supervisors must go to, that I give a brief presentation of what the supervisors need to know about the IG. So the county is very good about proactively getting this in there and informing employees who we are, when they need to talk to us, and some of their responsibilities. We have not had that good fortune with the municipalities. And I've only had a few municipalities that's had me in to speak. I'm going to be going, my next focus, I've been out, normally I get with city managers. I'm going to be now going to city commission meetings and try and get in from that aspect and talk, for a brief period, talk to the city commission, while they're there and telling a little bit of what we do, and also to the citizens who attend those. So that'll be my next outreach initiative. So these are, again, some of the places we've spoke at. Palm Beach Atlantic, I go in there and they ask me to speak both to some of their undergraduate and graduate classes on ethics in government and leadership in governments and who and what we do as an IG there. Again, these are some of the state and national places that we talked about before that we spoke at during these last 6 months. Our budget and staffing, again, we're at 25 people, about 63% staffed. We put requests in this year for the coming fiscal year with the county, and I'm hopeful that the county will provide us with some more resources to do our job. The picture on the right, that is for all the Game of Thrones fans out there. This is the ode to Game of Thrones with the dragon, for any of you that watches that, but which is on TV and the big thing right now. However, that's not actually the Game of Thrones dragon. That is actually from Walt Disney's Sleeping Beauty. If you know Prince Charming going up against the dragon, and I like to say that we're the OIG, that we're small, but again, we're, as you saw, we've got a very skilled staff and we've got some great tools to fight against fraud, waste, and abuse, and what we've got to work out.
Madam Chair, just a question. You struck a very interesting deal last year with the county on the internal audit jobs. Is there any further movement in that area, or was that just a one-time deal for positions?
We did not discuss that this year. I put forth my manpower requests. I provided that to them as an option, of many options they can come up with providing our staff the adequate staff that we need to do to meet our mission with all the county and the municipalities. So I put that out there as one option. I did not this year. I just put forth my request. I requested 4 people for next year. Again, what my thoughts are, a steady growth, understanding this is a number of people and it would be very difficult to do in 1 year. So I put my request in for 2 auditors and 2 investigators for next year. And so the county, I know, is working on that, and I'm hopeful that they'll come with us for a progression to where we need to be.
And if you were extremely lucky and get those 4, what would your percentage go to as far as staffing?
Oh,
If you could do the math.
need somebody who's good doing math, and yeah, 4 plus what we have, that would be 29 out of 40.
Okay.
Somebody quickly who's a
That's good. That's good enough.
Okay, 29 out of 40, so,
.725.
okay. So we're getting that.
Those are all Pierre.
Okay, that is so well. So, very good. So that's where we are in that. And again, we're going to continue to do our job with what we have, and
Assuming I take
and
it.
again, I'm pretty proud of our staff, of what we've done with what we have. And again, but this goes back to, you see, some of those investigations. Why do they take so long? That one in point. Well, this one with the city, there are other investigations that come forward, which is a higher priority, which are more, have more severity of it. Sometimes we have to make decisions to just put an investigation on hold and put our resources on the higher priority. And that's the cost. That's the cost of having a staff that is not fully staffed. Okay, legal update. I'm going to turn this over to Calinthia.
Good morning. I think we're still in the morning.
Morning.
I have one slide, so I will be brief. I want to briefly give you a status update on pending litigation concerning our office. We are a party to a case involving Section 119.0713, subsection 2, Florida statutes, which sets forth an exemption from the public records laws that applies specifically to local offices of Inspector General and to internal auditors. The particular language in that statute that's at the heart of this lawsuit was actually drafted by the Palm Beach County Attorney's Office back in 2011 after our office was set up And it was encouraged by the Inspector General at the time. And the goal really was to address the need for confidentiality of the records in our office because it didn't exist prior to this. And to protect the integrity of investigations, to minimize potential interference with investigations or audits, and to protect the reputations of subjects of those audits of investigations. So this litigation really is to test whether the statutory language as written is broad enough to cover complaints that give rise to audits or investigations in our office. So the circumstances that led to the litigation occurred when we were in the middle of an investigation, contacted someone to gather information. That person responded, "I want a copy of the complaint." The investigator declined to turn it over and said, "We'll give it to you after the investigation is complete." And as a result of that, the requester filed a lawsuit. So on March 13th, 2018, the citizen filed a petition asking the court to order us to turn over the complaint and to pay his attorney's fees and costs associated with the litigation under the public records law. The county attorney's office has been working with us. We've met with, and actually are defended by one of the litigators, and we've have as part of that team the person who actually drafted the legislation at issue. So the trial court ruled in our favor, said that after an evidentiary hearing that the complaint was covered by the exemption in the statute. The case is currently on appeal at the 4th District Court of Appeal. And the citizen filed his initial brief on January the 19th of this year. I'm sorry, January 29th of this year. The answer brief is due on May 31st, so in the next few days. It's our understanding that the Pinellas County Attorney's Office is going to file an amicus brief in support of our position in this case to basically lay out some of the public policy considerations, the impact that this case will have on local offices of inspectors general, and to discuss the legislative history. So, because some of the arguments that we make are really rooted in the heart of what's written in the legislative history. So we will keep you posted as the case progresses. Yes.
I guess you know John Scott, the IG in Broward. I don't know if he or Mary Cagle in Miami-Dade, are they going to join, or do you know yet?
As of right now, the only entity that we're aware of who is actually going to file something will be the Pinellas County office, but our goal is, once we take a look at it, to show it to some other offices in case they want to sign on to it as well.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, now where we're going in the future. Again, what we're going to be doing with the staff that we have now, you could see more and more we're doing integrated projects, and we're having our auditors, investigators, contract oversight working together and using all of their strengths. You can see a number of these complaints that come in. You know, some of them go to contract oversight working together. Some of these have turned into audits, so they're doing forensic type audits that are investigatory type of audits. So more and more we're using our staff, and we're not only inside, but we're working. I wish that Dave was here, or Al at least, that I could say we're working all the time, much more closely affiliated with the state attorney's office on ongoing cases, a number of them that become criminal, but yet we're continually working with them in the process to help assist them in bringing the case to fruition. So we're working on that. Again, we've talked about expanding our contract oversight division to look at not just the procurement side, but more focusing on the performance side, and particularly the one-penny sales tax issue. Like some of our projects were involved, this one project was involved with that one-penny sales tax there. So we're working that way. Now a big event that's going to be coming up is the annual Inspector General Conference. It's going to be held here in September of this year. Again, this is our national conference of Inspector Generals from the state, federal, local, international IGs are in this organization and will be attending and speaking during this conference. Just to give you some highlights, there are over 50 distinguished panelists and speakers from across the U.S. and again internationally who will be speaking at the conference with breakout sessions. We've invited Governor DeSantis to come and give our welcome address, and the Chief Inspector General of the state is trying to help to encourage to get him here for the welcoming address. Michael Horowitz, who is the chair of the Federal Council on Integrity and Efficiency of Inspector Generals, which is the federal organization of all the federal IGs. He's also the Department of Justice Inspector General, will be here and speak on some of the things at national level. Again, his office has done some pretty newsworthy inspections, investigations that I'm sure you're aware of in the last year. He may speak on those. We're also going to have Melinda Miguel, the Chief IG for the state, speak. Some of the topics will include, we've got the inspectors that were involved in Bridgegate. It's going to be a case study on Bridgegate. Measuring, we talked about this here often, about what are measures, and this is amongst IGs, we often talk about ourselves. What are measures of effectiveness that IGs can use? And it's different depending on the jurisdiction and the IG. Alternate approaches for IGs doing business, multiple agency case studies. And again, I'd mentioned to you all, we're going to have, at the start of it, usually the office that is sponsoring or who is hosting the conference, they often have something a little bit about their office. So what we like to have at the very start, day one, and you have in your packet, you have the whole draft agenda. But on day one, we wanted to have a panel, which I would coordinate, be the panel discussion leader. We would start out and we was going to have Randy Schultz, a very well-known local reporter that many of you know, that would talk about the initiation of how this office, you know, all the background that came about how the office and the Commission on Ethics and the Code of Ethics, you know, the seeds that took place. David Baker then will come from Leadership Palm Beach County, the Citizens Ethics Initiative, to talk about the citizens movement and the grand jury that all started. And then I wanted to ask one of the IG committee members to be a panel member to talk about, okay, and here's where we are today, and some of the things we are in the county, and you can not only speak about the IG committee, but potentially the Commission on Ethics, and you know, up to where we are today. It's about 50 minutes, about 10 person each. So on the agenda, you could either talk now or after I'm finished about maybe selecting a panel member. Now, of course, you're all welcome to attend during that, but we would like to have one panel member to speak for the IG committee during the conference. So it's going to be I think a great conference, very good, and we're going to have, we anticipate over 300 people attending the conference. Summary of accomplishments. Again, this is just overall. Since we've been in existence, some of our costs that we've been looking at. $46.3 million in question costs, $23.8 million in potential cost savings, and that includes both identified cost and avoidable costs. We put those together. 152 referrals from our office to law enforcement commissions on ethics. So again, back to the issue of referrals, we do a lot of referrals. We are a heavy referral that comes in just not only as a result of our investigations, but complaints that come in that we do an assessment, and oftentimes goes to state, local Commission on Ethics. 19 arrests directly as a result of the work. So these are directly result of our audits and investigations that we have done that have resulted in arrests since we've been around. We're up to almost 1,000 recommendations to make government better with a high acceptance rate, 94% acceptance rate. And again, we are the ear for citizens, employees, for people to call when they need help, when they see something's wrong. And again, as you saw, it's just not when they find something wrong in our government, but oftentimes they don't know who to call, so they call us, and we get them to the right place that can help them out. That concludes our brief for today. Are there any questions or comments?
Well, actually, that does bring us to the agenda item for discussion, so questions, comments from the committee?
Madam Chair, I would like to volunteer to help General Carey out on his panel, unless anybody else would really like to beat me to it.
Wonderful.
That's all I have.
I thought I saw a hand down there. No? Oh, please, ask away.
I was curious, I'm sorry, going back for a minute to the arrests and prosecutions. Do you keep track of convictions and restitution?
No, we just keep track of arrests and prosecutions and arrests. That's our track on that.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Very briefly, I think this morning's meeting, and thank you everybody who had a hand in pulling this together. It was really thorough and very helpful. It underscores the important work of oversight done by both the Commission on Ethics and the Office of Inspector General. And I'm especially proud to be part of an organization whose goal is to try to help government work better and help people avoid getting into trouble. We're more interested in prevention than catching and punishing, and I think that can't be overstated. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Any other comments or questions? For myself, I'll say thank you also. It's clearly a lot of work, even just to prepare for the presentation and to opening yourselves up to questions and some tough questions even, and you do it with professionalism, and you always take our questions and suggestions to heart. And I've noticed every 6 months you're coming back and you're remembering things that we said last time, and that professionalism is appreciated. You really take it to heart. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
That brings us to public comment. Are there any comments from the public or anybody from the Ethics Commission staff? Your name's been brought up a lot today. Seeing none, hearing none. New business, we actually already heard about the annual training conference, right? So that covers new business. And I don't see any hands going halfway up to bring up any new business, in which case we are adjourned. Thank you so much.